Good evening, everybody. I'm Carter Sneed. I'm the director of the DeNicola Center for Ethics and Culture, professor of law and concurrent professor of political science here at the University of Notre Dame. And I'd like to welcome all of you to the fourth evening of our 2020 Vita Institute webinar. The mission of the Center for Ethics and Culture is to share the richness of the Catholic moral and intellectual tradition through teaching, research, and public engagement at the highest level across a variety of disciplines, both here on campus at Notre Dame and in the global public square as Notre Dame. The Vita Institute is the flagship offering of our Culture of Life programming here at the DeNicola Center. This webinar series will provide you with a small taste of our week-long Vita Institute intellectual formation program that each summer since 2010 has brought pro-life leaders from around the world to the campus of Notre Dame to study the fundamentals of the life issues with world-renowned scholars across a wide range of disciplines, including social science, law, biology, philosophy, theology, communications, and counseling. Our full Vita Institute program includes more than 20 presentations covering the full spectrum of topics essential to building a culture of life, including such important issues as racial inequality, disability, adoption, euthanasia and assisted suicide, public health policy, epidemiology, integral human development, and many more topics as well. In this week's condensed series of presentations, we've been highlighting issues surrounding the beginnings of life. So let's go ahead and continue this exciting week of learning and conversation together. A brief note about the format of tonight's presentation. In a moment, our speaker will join us to deliver her live remarks. During her talk, we invite those of you who are logged into the Zoom webinar to pose our speaker questions using the Q&A function. We're going to select representative questions or perhaps synthesize multiple questions into representative singular questions to pose to our speaker when she concludes her remarks. And because we didn't have time to take questions last night at the end of my presentation, U.S. abortion law and policy, we also welcome you to submit any questions you might have about that topic, and I'll address them in course. Tonight's speaker is a great friend of the Vita Institute and the DeNicola Center, and my friend as well, Jessica Keating. Jessica directs the Notre Dame Office of Life and Human Dignity in the McGrath Institute for Church Life here at Notre Dame. In her role, she leads the Institute's research, education, and outreach efforts around life and human dignity issues and spearheads the Institute's development of pro-life curricula and resources. Jess originally hails from Maryland, the Maryland suburbs of Washington, D.C. She holds undergraduate degrees from St. Joseph University in philosophy and sociology. She taught high school theology for 5 years at the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, after which she completed her Masters of Divinity from the University of Notre Dame in 2013. She's directed the Office of Life and Human Dignity since that time, and in addition to her work with the Institute, she is currently pursuing her Ph.D. in Systematic Theology here at Notre Dame. Jess is a regular conference presenter, and her writing has appeared in publications such as America Magazine, Church Life Journal, The Imaginative Conservative, as well as in the volume of essays entitled Dante, Mercy, and the Beauty of the Human Person. Without further ado, we're delighted to welcome our friend Jess Keating, speaking on feminism and abortion.
Thanks, Carter, and thanks to all of you for logging in today. It's a delight to be here, and I'm grateful for the center for asking me to share this presentation with you. My stake in the question at hand is a personal one, because I was a pro-choice feminist. As a gender studies minor, I imbibed the kind of contradictory message that women were both powerful individuals who acted as autonomous agents, except when they were victims, caught in patriarchal social structures. This narrative was an indiscernible back and forth between agency and victimization. And the feminism of my college years sort of gave me this intellectual whiplash. And I noticed these early twinges of dissonance early on, but it would take me the better part of a decade, including 5 years of teaching on a reservation and a very frank remark from an ex-Catholic priest turned Catholic worker, to sort through the intellectual quagmire in which I had invested a substantial part of my identity. I grew up in the DC suburbs in the 1980s, the glorious era of shoulder pads and Madonna, and I was enlightened. We all knew, though we never spoke it out loud, that only uneducated conservative Catholics and misogynists were pro-life. And even today, my sister is the yearbook sponsor for my high school's yearbook, and they still can't find students willing to admit that they've gone on the March for Life. So it's with this personal stake in this question that I come to the question of feminism and abortion. In the 1949 classic, The Second Sex, Simone de Beauvoir offers a description of abortion that suggests an acute conflict. On the one hand, she observes that men take abortion too lightly, regarding it as one of the hazards of being a woman. According to de Beauvoir, abortion allows men to, quote, fulfill his destiny as man. Men publicly declare abortion an abomination while privately accepting it as sort of a, quote, convenient solution to a problem. On the other hand, however, she insists that abortion is necessary for women's emancipation, freeing them from reproductive slavery and, quote, enforced maternity, even as she describes the devastating effects that abortion has on women in terms of a haunting tragedy as a result of sexual exploitation and as a form of self-alienation. A note on language here. In our cultural context, enforced maternity typically means not having access to abortion, to elective abortion. But for early feminists, enforced maternity more nearly indicated a pregnancy that resulted from sexual exploitation. De Beauvoir's use of the term appears to mark a transition from this original meaning to its more contemporary meaning. Despite the tragic picture that she paints of abortion, de Beauvoir provides a particularly dark view of pregnancy as reducing a woman to passive instrumentality, thereby frustrating her self-transcendence, that is her ability to act, because the unborn child, which is at once part of her, is also a parasite which feeds on her body. She views pregnancy as a modality, in the modality of a disease. The woman is accorded no creative power in making the child that she carries. Rather, she, quote, engenders flesh only. The child represents to the woman her thwarted self-actualization. Abortion thus becomes a mode of self-assertion, a first moment of self-actualization. Thus, it becomes her first moment of self-knowledge. Beauvoir says it is at her first abortion that a woman begins to, quote, know. In many ways, de Beauvoir's presentation typifies the type of feminist argumentation I encountered as a gender studies student, in which the male body and experience of the world is accepted as normative for equality. Indeed, legal scholars have pointed out that the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, which is the basis for the constitutional right to abortion, fundamentally privileges male normativity as the axial center of equality. Clinging to this worldview, pro-choice feminism has become less thoughtful in the past century. Consider, for example, the comments of a Georgetown University English professor, Elizabeth Velez, who in 2007 told the Washington Post, quote, "Feminism is a political movement. And if you are not part of that political movement, you can't be a feminist. If you are pro-life, you are certainly not looking at the struggles across all of us." I quote Velez not in order to single her out for critique, but because her assertion is representative of a prominent view within feminist discourse, a view that systematically silences the dissonance and pluralism within the feminist movement. Her comments also suggest the central questions and contours of a complex history of feminism and abortion that, though they are well documented, remain relatively obscure in our cultural discourse. Indeed, Velez raises a series of interesting and important problems, ranging from the philosophical to the empirical. For example, what is feminism? What are its goals as a political movement? Who exercises the power and authority to define its boundaries? When and how did the approbation of abortion become a central, if not the central, structuring and dogmatic principle of feminism for so many women? And finally, is abortion integral to women's equality and freedom? And if not, how does the fetishization of abortion collude with structures of domination to compromise women's freedom? And how can feminism, a richer feminism, promote the flourishing of human communities for all people, for women, for men, and for children? None of these questions have easy, ready-made answers. However, I think by exploring the complex histories of feminism and abortion and how they weave together in and out of each other, we'll discover that from its inception, the feminist movement and feminists were deeply concerned with the exploitation of women and considered abortion to be another form of women's violent oppression. We'll also see that historically, the contemporary abortion rights movement is not simply a natural or inevitable development from feminism, but is rather a chimeric offspring of the eugenics movement, the population control ideology, and the sexual revolution. And while some feminists, like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, had eugenic leanings, which pro-life feminists of today must denounce, the two movements are not coextensive. Therefore, the claim that abortion is central to feminism is belied by a history of feminism itself, which demonstrates a far richer and far more complex picture, one in which abortion advocacy plays a rather dubious role. In order to shed light on this complicated relationship, we'll delve into the story of feminism, locate the emergence of particular strands of pro-choice feminism, and trace the consistently pro-life strand that runs through the feminist movement from its inception to today. So the French philosopher and social theorist Charles Fourier is credited with coining the term feminism in the early 19th century. It entered the American political lexicon in 1910. However, women had been speaking out against their inferior status and asserting their right to equality for centuries prior to Fourier coining the term. The beginning of modern feminism typically dates from the writings of Olympe de Gouges' Declaration of the Rights of Women and the Female Citizen in 1791, and Mary Wollstonecraft, pictured here, A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, the following year in 1792. Indeed, for many university students, Wollstonecraft's A Vindication is among the first texts they read in a feminist philosophy and literature course. No doubt, both men and women had written about the woman question long before the 18th century, debating both the nature and the social status of women. Nevertheless, Wollstonecraft's text presents an intervention during a period of tremendous social upheaval. Of course, we know by 1792, the French Revolution was in full swing. The American colonies had fought and defeated the British for independence, and both the German and British Enlightenments dominated the intellectual landscape. Following in the footsteps of Mary Estelle, who published, quote, a serious proposal to the ladies a century earlier in 1697, Wollstonecraft argues for women's equality and education. She denounces the false idolization of women and, quote, the false system of education of women that enfeebles the mind with false refinement and makes women more like an alluring mistress than an affectionate wife and rational mother. Indeed, Wollstonecraft suggests that, quote, women are in fact so much degraded and by mistaken notions of female excellence that this artificial weakness produces a tendency to tyrannize, gives birth to cunning, the natural opponent of strength, which leads them to play off those contemptible infantine airs that undermine esteem even whilst they excite desire, end quote. Wollstonecraft argues for the education of women in order that she may fully exercise her freedom and virtue, writing in a letter to a French diplomat, quote, if woman, be not prepared by education to become the companion of man, she will stop the progress of knowledge and virtue. And how can a woman be expected to cooperate unless she know why she comprehend her duty and see in what manner it is connected with her real good? If children are to be educated to understand the principle of true patriotism, their mother must be a patriot, and the love of mankind from which the orderly train of virtues spring can only be by considering the moral and civil interests of mankind. The education and situation of woman at present shuts her out from such investigations, end quote. I cite Wollstonecraft not because she makes any particular claims about abortion, she doesn't, or its precursor, which was infanticide, but because she frames women's rights within the context of the well-being of the family, society, and the political order. As the mother of contemporary feminism, her work demonstrates that the origins of feminism are grounded in a robust understanding of virtue and truth that are directed to the well-being of both women and children and men. By the mid-19th century, however, feminist arguments against abortion are commonplace. Advocates of abortion rights today generally ignore this anti-abortion history in feminism. When they do acknowledge it, they seek to discredit it in one of two ways. First, they'll argue that the early feminist remonstration against abortion was not integral to their feminism. These detractors claim that the pro-life beliefs of women like Alice Paul and Elizabeth Blackwell are merely coincidental to their feminism, or an unfortunate personal flaw, comparable perhaps to Thomas Jefferson's incongruous participation in the slave economy despite his declaration that all men are created equal. The second argument suggests that the feminist objection to abortion was based solely on the extreme danger that abortion posed to a woman's health and safety. Because concern was for women's lives and safety, once medical advances make abortion, quote, safe, the feminist opposition to abortion is rendered obsolete. As we'll see, each of these arguments is unsubstantiated. Indeed, while birth control was a hotly debated question among early feminists, opposition to abortion was not. Even free love feminists like Victoria Woodhull agreed with her more conservative counterparts in the condemnation of abortion as an egregious crime against women and children. And while they were deeply concerned about the impact of abortion upon women, these early advocates for women's equality were equally concerned for the lives of unborn children and did not hesitate to call abortion what it was and what it is: child murder and infanticide. For women like Elizabeth Blackwell, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Alice Paul, abortion constitutes an act of violence against women and children. They view it as a terrible consequence of the social devaluation of motherhood and the treatment of pregnancy as a disease, even a crime. Elizabeth Blackwell, for instance, regarded abortion with disgust. In fact, it was upon learning of Madame Restel's services that Blackwell was spurred to action. Madame Restel, whose real name was Anna Lohman, was an infamous abortionist in New York in the mid-19th century. Though she had no formal medical training, she is reportedly the first provider of such services to sell the idea of abortion to the American public through newspaper advertisements. These ads, which appeared in the New York Herald, suggested that abortion was, quote, loving to husbands, kind to children already born, easy to accomplish, fair to women, and in the end, maybe not abortion at all. As early as the 1830s, Restel anticipates the arguments that are still in use over 200 years later to justify abortion, including the pathologization of pregnancy, the distinction between wanted and unwanted children. Perhaps most notable, however, is Restel's euphemistic use of language for abortion, such as, and these are quotes from her, an attempt to remove female blockages, or, quote, a cure for the stoppage of menses, which anticipates the familiar language of abortion rights advocates today, language like the products of conception or uterine tissue. Blackwell, who would go on to become the first female physician in the United States, denounced Restel's self-styling as a, quote, female physician. Of her disregard for women and children in the name of medicine, Blackwell writes of Restel, quote, the gross perversion and destruction of motherhood by the abortionist filled me with indignation and awakened active antagonism. That honorable term, female physician, should be exclusively applied to those women on this shocking trade seemed to me a horror. I finally determined to do what I could to redeem the hells, and especially from the one hell thus forced upon my notice. For Blackwell, opposing abortion was not an incidental part of her feminism, but it was central. It is the motivating impetus behind her life's work as a physician. Nor was she the lone voice in the feminist wilderness of the 19th century. The denunciation of abortion was a persistently repeated theme throughout early feminist literature. In The Revolution, a leading feminist newspaper of the day, which was founded by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Parker Pillsbury, abortion is never referred to approvingly, or even with a sense of resigned acceptance. Rather, it's always linked to the sexual exploitation and oppression of women and the murder of children. Indeed, abortion is decried by these women as a social evil and as a symptom of a woman's lack of education and of her oppression. On the pages of The Revolution, Elizabeth Cady Stanton declares, quote, we are living today under a dynasty of force. The masculine element is everywhere, overpowering the feminine, crushing women and children alike beneath its feet. Let woman assert herself in all her native purity, dignity, and strength, and end this wholesale suffering and murder of helpless children. With centuries of degradation, we have so little of true womanhood that the world has but the faintest glimmering of what a woman is or should be. Elsewhere, Eleanor Kirk, a single mother and leading journalist in the mid-19th century, inveighed against abortion as a symptom of women's oppression. She said, what will become of the babies? What has become of the babies? Ask Restel and thousands of physicians, male and female, who have been engaged in their work of destruction for years. Physicians who have graduated from our first medical colleges, physicians with high-sounding diplomas, whose elegant equipages stand in front of their Fifth Avenue mansion, who pocket a little fee and a little bundle of flesh at the same time, and nobody's the wiser, not even the husband in a host of instances. What will become of the babies? Did you ask? And you? Can you not see that the idea is to educate women that they may be self-reliant, self-sustaining, and self-respected? Indeed, Kirk argues that if women were able to fully participate in society as women, society would be infused with, quote, more love and more tenderness. Those who performed abortions or offered abortifacients were also prohibited from advertising in the pages of The Revolution, a decision that undoubtedly cost the newspaper substantial revenue. Parker Pillsbury, the co-founder of The Revolution, explained the rationale for this decision in the March 26, 1868 edition. He writes, quote, quack advertisements may lie never so fearfully about the stuffs offered for sale, but they speak truly of those who make and sell them. and not less truly of their accomplices of the press that for gain and greed will advertise and puff their foul preparations. He continues saying, quack medicine vendors, however rich, proud, and pretentious, feticides and infanticides should be classed together and regarded with shuddering horror by the whole human race. Child murder, both before and after birth, is a regular and terrible to tell, a vastly extensive business. And it is known to newspaper publishers that its advertising patronage pays far better than any other. Indeed, instead of running advertisements for Madame Rustle, the revolution covered the work of doctors Elizabeth and Emily Blackwell, as well as Charlotte Lozier, who, as an aside, the paper reported in the December 6th, 1869 issue, counseled a young woman against abortion, offering her, quote, any assistance in her power to give, and assisted in the arrest and prosecution of the man who had accompanied the girl to New York, posing as her cousin. So if access to abortion is not an original grounding feminist principle, where does it originate and how does it become incorporated in the feminist movement? Activism for abortion rights, I would argue, has its roots in eugenics and fears about population control. Though we rarely learn about this in our history classes, it's really difficult to overstate how widespread the fear of overpopulation was in the 19th and 20th centuries. Indeed, it still is today. Or the ubiquity of the eugenics movement, which was everywhere. Birth control, sterilization, and abortion all have their common roots in the eugenics movement. Emerging in the wake of the Civil War, eugenics seemed to offer a scientific solution to social problems, such as poverty, mental illness, and criminality. The eugenics movement sought to combine the advances in the Industrial Revolution with the scientific discoveries of Gregor Mendel and Charles Darwin to engineer a better human race. The eugenicists applied principles of agricultural farming to human reproduction. And these were underwritten by powerful business tycoons like J.H. Kellogg and Rockefeller. The eugenic philosophy and science was popularized in prestigious universities throughout the late 19th and 20th century. The contemporary historian Jill Lepore describes the widespread acceptance and promotion of eugenics in American universities. In 1906, for instance, biologist David Jordan, who at the time was the president of Stanford University, led the committee of the American Breeders Association, which, quote, sought to investigate and report on heredity in the human race and to document the value of superior blood and the menace to society of inferior blood. In 1910, zoologist Charles Davenport, who was a professor at Harvard, defined eugenics as, quote, the science of human improvement by better breeding. And beginning in our state of Indiana here in 1907, 2/3 of states passed forced sterilization laws. Around the country, state fairs held fittest family contests and better baby contests. According to these principles of positive eugenics, people with desirable traits should be encouraged to have more children, while people with undesirable traits, the poor, ethnic and racial minorities, the disabled, were to be counseled to use birth control or sterilize, maybe against their will. The most infamous eugenicist in this context, for our discussion, of course, is Margaret Sanger, who advocated that women be educated about birth control as a means to limit family size. Sanger is a very complicated figure. She's caricatured by both those who hate her and by those who love her. In some ways, she resembles early feminists. She advocates voluntary maternity and bodily integrity, much as early feminists did. And like these feminists, she condemned the sexual exploitation and objectification of women. Yet she differed from many feminists in her promotion of artificial contraceptives, some of whom presciently saw that birth control would lead to the further exploitation of women. Sanger is one of the world's most well-known and controversial advocates of birth control as a principal means to emancipation. As the founder of the American Birth Control League, which later became Planned Parenthood, she popularized limiting family size through contraception as essential to women's liberation. Motherhood, in Sanger's view, is ancillary, even problematic for women's equality. And anticipating in some ways Simone de Beauvoir, Sanger wrote, quote, "Enforced motherhood is the most complete denial of a woman's right to life and liberty." At the same time, she did not publicly advocate for abortion, unlike her English counterpart, Stella Brown, who was an early and vigorous advocate for abortion. Indeed, Brown criticized Sanger for not taking a more radical stand. As it is, Sanger's own views on abortion are murky. During her tenure as the editor of the Birth Control Review, the journal did publish a handful of articles on abortion, though none by Sanger, and family limitation. Another pamphlet, a sex education pamphlet, did describe how to induce an abortion. However, Larry Latter, who is the chief architect of the modern abortion rights movement and Sanger's biographer, parted ways with her, supposedly because of her opposition to abortion. Nevertheless, she was a staunch supporter of eugenics and brought eugenics and feminism into closer contact than any previous feminist. She promoted birth control as a way to control the birth rate among the poor, the mentally defective, and undesirables. She wrote, quote, "We are spending billions, literally billions, keeping alive thousands who never, in all human compassion, should have been brought into this world. We are spending more in maintaining morons than in developing the inherent talents of gifted children. We are coddling the incurably defective and neglecting potential geniuses," end quote. Eugenicists often oppose social programs to improve the lives of the poor, arguing that such programs would have the unfortunate effect of extending their lives and leading to more reproduction. In a 1939 letter written to Clarence Gamble of Procter & Gamble, Sanger offers a particularly chilling strategy for promoting birth control among African Americans, who were rightly very suspicious of eugenic efforts. She wrote, quote, "It seems to me from my experience that while the colored Negroes have a great respect for white doctors, they can get closer to their own members and more or less lay their cards on the table, which means their ignorance, superstitions, and doubts. They do not do this with white doctors, and if we can train Negro doctors at the clinic, he can go to them with enthusiasm and knowledge, which will have far-reaching results among colored people." She goes on to say the minister's work is also important, and he should be trained, perhaps by the Federation, as to our ideals and the goals we hope to reach. We do not want word to go out that we want to exterminate the Negro population, and the minister is the man who can straighten out that idea if it ever occurs to any of their more rebellious members, end quote. Eugenic undertones or overtones are palpable. Whether these remarks are meant in earnest or cynically is really of little import. They're chilling. Moreover, given the historical and social context, it is difficult to construe these words as merely benign or even as sort of a political ploy. Yet some Sanger apologists like Gloria Steinem contend that Sanger only used eugenic language in order to gain popular support for birth control. I think this is belied by her own writings and a whole body of evidence that shows she was a committed eugenicist. Sanger used a blended approach to advocate for widespread contraceptive use. Women's emancipation on the one hand and eugenics on the other. Echoing some early feminists, she argued that women need birth control to be truly equal to men, but she also wholeheartedly embraced the eugenic aims of birth control to stem the tide of unwanted and, more importantly, undesirable children. You can hear the echoes of Madame Restel. Contraception, she declared, was necessary to promote racial health. It only takes a short but logical step to move from the eugenic use of birth control to abortion. And indeed, abortion continues to disproportionately impact poor women and women of color, essentially serving the same eugenic ends that Sanger had articulated for birth control back in the 1920s and 30s. Black women today are 5 times as likely to have an abortion as white women, and Hispanic women are twice as likely. Though Sanger herself seems to suggest that abortion is undesirable and she expresses ambivalence, her blended approach to contraception becomes the standard for pro-choice feminists in their arguments for abortion. And the organization she founded, of course, is the world's largest abortion provider. With the exception of a few feminists like Stella Brown, the first advocates for legal abortion were nearly all men who argued for the expansion of legalized abortion, not on feminist grounds, but on the basis of the threat that illegal abortion posed to women's lives and or the eugenic principle of weeding out those children who were undesirable and unwanted. Abortion was also presented as necessary for women's health and as legitimate, if unfortunate sacrifice made for the greater good of society. Yet it's not legal abortion, but the advent of penicillin in the 1940s that made abortion, quote unquote, safer for women. The deaths from illegal abortion plummet after penicillin is widely available. Despite this, we still hear this argument from Planned Parenthood presidents and from abortion promoters continue to claim that thousands of women will die every year if Roe v. Wade is overturned. As recently as just a couple of years ago, Lena Wen, then the president of Planned Parenthood, said in an interview with the Washington Post, quote, "We're not going back to a time before Roe when thousands of women died every year because they didn't have access to essential health care." This assertion continues to be made, even though it's been proven false multiple times. And in fact, the Washington Post gave it 4 Pinocchios. So that shows how trustworthy that claim is. While illegal abortion is no longer posing a serious threat to women's lives and health, abortion rights advocates advance their cause on the basis of eugenics as well, fear of overpopulation, which began in the early 1960s, and along with women's liberation. All 3 of these, women's health, eugenics, population control, and women's liberation, are used throughout the 60s and 70s to advance abortion rights. One excerpt from the National Association for the Repeal of Abortion Laws, which later becomes the National Abortion Rights Action League, NARAL, reads, quote, "Unwanted children are a social danger. Society suffers the consequences of ill-advised parenthood for decades, even generations." Thomas Malthus, who's sort of the father of population control fears, although he was a committed Christian who never would have supported what his research was used to endorse. His fears of overpopulation were also stoked by the publication of Stanford biologist Paul Ulrich's The Population Bomb in 1968, which contributed to the mass exportation of abortion overseas. The United States is the exporter of abortion. Finally, radical feminists such as Pat McGinnis mark a major turning point in shifting the reasoning for abortion. McGinnis is quoted as saying that abortion should be available, quote, "to any woman for any reason to end an unwanted pregnancy." We see here a reinterpretation from the early feminine dictum of voluntary motherhood, meaning not being sexually exploited, to the need for abortion as bodily autonomy. So Our early feminist mothers are concerned about the relational equality of men and women, not securing the right to child murder. Moreover, feminist rhetoric begins to incorporate the eugenic distinction between wanted and unwanted. But the chief architect of the abortion rights movement is Larry Ladder, a little known figure who wrote many books on abortion and whose book, Abortion, is quoted several times in the Roe decision, and who really masterfully crafted a propaganda campaign, eventually convincing Betty Friedan to incorporate abortion into the women's liberation platform. Notably, the first edition of the Feminine Mystique does not mention abortion. It's not until the second edition, after she's met Ladder, that she would include abortion as part of the feminist platform. And she called Ladder the father of the movement, the father of the abortion rights movement. So women's rights movement of the 1960s inaugurates a new relationship between feminism and abortion, one in which the two movements are really yoked together. The early feminist concern for bodily integrity became in the 60s a concern for bodily autonomy. The fight for equal rights came to include the fight for abortion, and murder sort of metamorphosizes into choice. Women's liberation no longer, it seems, includes motherhood. As pro-choice feminism solidified its stranglehold over the women's rights movement, pro-life feminists were systematically excluded from these organizations. For instance, the National Organization of Women now kicked out pro-life feminists from their ranks early after their founding. And again, we saw this back in 2018 when the Women's March struck the New Wave feminists from their sponsorship. Just as an aside, Pam Goltz and Catherine Callahan formed Feminists for Life, which is a very prominent pro-life feminist group, in the wake of their expulsion from the National Organization of Women. But today it can often be difficult to discern exactly where feminism ends and abortion rights advocacy begins, because the two have become in some ways so deeply intertwined. Since its inception, pro-choice feminist arguments typically rely on some combination of arguments, ranging from the contingent value of fetal life to the absolute right of bodily autonomy to women's right to equality, many of which we heard about on Monday, many of the philosophical arguments. Arguments ranging from Judith Jarvis Thompson's well-known thought experiment involving the violinist to Rosalind Pachetsky's assertion that the fetus is, quote, a biological parasite. Even feminist care ethicists who normally really reject the political and legal hegemony of autonomy nevertheless fall back on autonomy when they want to justify abortion. What we see is that nearly every feminist argument, pro-choice argument for abortion, privileges male normativity, radical autonomy, and womblessness. In order to participate equally in society, women must behave as men. Sydney Callahan, however, a leading pro-life feminist, notes the ironic turn in pro-choice feminism. She writes, quote, "Many pro-choice feminists, deliberately childless, adopt the male perspective when they cite the basic injustice that women have to bear babies. Women's biologically unique capacity and privilege has been denied, despised, and suppressed under male domination. Unfortunately, many women have fallen for the phallic fallacy." Pro-life feminists like Callahan locate abortion within a larger structure of the sexual agenda that relies on female sexual availability. In this new configuration of sexual relations, which emerges in the mid-20th century, the crudest form of male sexual behavior, becomes the ideal for women. Suddenly, short-term, commitmentless, consequence-free, and commodified sex become the ideal for women's liberation. If you're a Jane Austen fan, it's as though Mr. Willoughby suddenly becomes the apex of women's liberation. For Mary Winter, the founder of Women Concerned for Unborn Children, offered this scathing assessment of this new regime. "I find it," she says, quote, "I find it simply incredible when I see new feminists and male population control technocrats and other women exploiters like the Playboy Foundation use each other to foster their own ends. Women who lead the abortion feminist movement are willing to tolerate and work with sexploitative men for money and power, for the money and power these men provide to promote abortion. And you'll see here on your screen an image of Larry Ladder, Bernard Nathanson, who later came to revoke his early pro-choice leanings, and Hugh Hefner, the founder of Playboy. Winter's evocation of Playboy isn't simply an expression of generalized disdain for sexual exploitation. Hugh Hefner and the Playboy Foundation directly sponsored lower court cases that led up to Roe. Pro-life feminists, i.e. the majority of feminists, historically speaking, view abortion as a continued attack on women, not to mention children. Near the end of her life, the suffragist Alice Paul, who lived long enough to see feminism co-opted by abortion rights, poignantly observed, "How can one protect and help women by killing them as babies?" Paul vehemently protested the incorporation of abortion rights into the 1967 Equal Rights Amendment. She herself had written an earlier version of the Equal Rights Amendment in 1923, precisely because she considered abortion to be, quote, the ultimate exploitation of women. Pro-life feminists point out again and again that pro-choice feminists have forgotten the core values of the women's movement, namely women's full participation in society as women. Nearly 50 years out from Roe and Doe, we have to ask ourselves if abortion has delivered on its promise of equality for women as women, Many pro-choice advocates leap to the conclusion that yes, of course, abortion has been indispensable to women's advancement. Yet women still do not earn equal pay for equal work. Childcare is still largely unaffordable. Parental leave is still grossly insufficient. America's maternal health is abysmal. The United States has the worst maternal mortality rate among developed nations. And some studies suggest that women who have abortions are approximately 88% more likely to suffer from mental illness. And when's the last time anyone saw a place to pump in a McDonald's? Pro-life feminists point out that the permissive abortion laws in our country inadvertently and sometimes explicitly pathologize pregnancy. That is, they make pregnancy a disease. Analogizing the fetus to a parasite turns pregnancy into a medical condition that needs to be cured. Recall the evaluation of early feminists that abortion is a terrible consequence of the social devaluation of motherhood and the treatment of pregnancy as a disability in the workplace, at the doctor's office, and in the home. An argument that has long been made in an effort to internationalize abortion is one that abortion is safer than pregnancy. And this is important in sort of the diseasification of pregnancy, is now we hear arguments that it's safer to have an abortion than to be pregnant. However, the same things that make abortion supposedly safe for women are the same things that make pregnancy safe. So what women in Africa, for instance, need are blood banks and sterilized medical equipment, not abortion. Moreover, pro-choice feminists reinscribe male normativity into public and private spaces. For women to function in the public sphere, they must function as men. As the former president of Feminists for Life of America, Rosemary Botcher, writes, those who advocate legal abortion concede that pregnant women are intolerably handicapped. They cannot compete in the male world of woundless efficiency. In the private sphere, women are expected to conform to the male paradigm of sexual permissiveness without long-term commitment, or as Judy Loesch sort of brashly puts it, the idea that a man can use a woman, vacuum her out, and she's ready to be used again. Recent sociological studies, such as Mark Regner's work, have pointed out the detrimental effect that this has on women's mental health. Sidney Callahan suggests that permissive abortion laws do not, in fact, bring women reproductive freedom, social equality, sexual fulfillment, or personal development. Rather, they devalue motherhood and legitimate male sexual irresponsibility. This new arrangement between men and women, coupled with a really anemic understanding of what freedom and choice are, all conspire to isolate women by making reproduction a private choice. My body, my choice isn't just, sort of pernicious pro-life sloganeering. It's also highly problematic for pregnant women, because if this is the case, then it's her choice to have a baby, and she bears total responsibility, while men, society at large can sort of shrug off their duty to women and to children. Many pro-choice philosophers have also failed to see the irony in their pro-choice position. Women fought for hundreds of years for equality and for recognition of their full personhood. Yet in order to gain their full personhood, they have to deny the humanity of the unborn. And so they've sort of adopted the same patriarchal justifications that were used to deny their full personhood a century ago. So we have sort of the simultaneous rejection and reinscription of patriarchal power. So new challenges. I want to conclude here with new challenges for us. Ever since Bill Clinton coined the term safe, legal, and rare in 1996 to describe the Democratic position on abortion, feminist arguments for abortion have once again reconfigured themselves. In the past, abortion was considered an unfortunate but necessary evil, first to protect women's lives and to improve society, and then for them to gain parity with men. As problematic as these arguments were, we now face a pro-choice feminism that has recast abortion as a positive good and as a standard part of healthcare. So Teen Vogue, which is where these images are from, and whose target audience is tweens, so 12 to 14-year-olds, regularly runs articles that positively promote abortion. They even a few years ago put out a gift guide on what to get your friend after her first abortion, making abortion just another occasion to shop. Planned Parenthood campaigns like Shout Your Abortion, Celebrate Abortion, not only as a personal good, but as a social good. So abortion has shifted from being an unfortunate evil to a positive social good. In the past few years, abortion advocates have also begun conceding that abortion is, in fact, a form of killing. In publications from the popular to the scholarly, pro-choice feminists will argue that abortion is a kind of killing, one qualified by the conditional value of fetal life and a woman's absolute autonomy, but one that is necessary for women's equality. So while these arguments about the status of prenatal children are still common in the public sphere, in the abortion rights avant-garde, pro-choice feminists are testing new arguments, which concede that the unborn children are, shocker, human, and that abortion is killing. For instance, in this recent book, The Scarlet A, Northwestern University law professor and medical ethicist Kate Watson suggests that she is offering a, quote, thick description of ordinary abortion, and also trying to combat the vitriolic landscape of the national debate. But this really isn't all that's going on in this text. Watson's overall argument turns on the absolute distinction between ethics and law. So something is ethical if it happens. And so abortion is ethical because it happens. She offers case after case in which women clearly express abortion as not the ideal, as sort of the unchoice, that they feel vulnerable. And she reinforces the patriarchal structures that prop up and benefit from abortion. Finally, in The Scarlet A, Watson argues that abortion is part of restorative health. And this perplexed me the first time that I read it. I thought, what is she doing here with restorative health and talking about bringing women back to baseline? She says abortion is not an illness or an injury, but simply a routine aspect of medical decision making in which the worth of fetal life is subjectively determined by a woman and her doctor. Abortion, she says, quote, brings a woman back to baseline. So what she means by that is women spend most of their lives not pregnant. And so when you have an abortion, you're just going back to what your condition for most of your life is. And I was very confused when I first read this and asked a doctor, and she told me that this is part of the restorative health rhetoric, that when we talk about bringing a patient back to baseline in restorative health, we're talking about restoring them to their previous condition. Of course, none of us are ever restored to our previous condition, but this is now being used to talk about abortion as restoring women to full health and to full bodily integrity. So what next? We've traced the history of feminism. We have looked at what sort of what's typically called first wave feminism has told us about abortion, that there is a strong and consistent pro-life feminism from its inception. We've seen how abortion sort of surreptitiously gets woven into feminism through eugenics and population control, and how it's justified using different arguments around bodily autonomy. And now these newest forms of argument, which are admitting that it is killing and that it is okay to kill this class of human beings, which when I tell this to some of my pro-life friends say, well, that's great. Everyone will see how crazy that is. But I think what we're seeing is actually very dangerous, that it's becoming okay now to make these arguments in the public sphere. So for pro-life feminists, there's a big job to make their argument in the public sphere. And there are a number of different ways that we can talk about doing this, but we'll have to address these new forms of argument, especially the argument that killing is ethically permissible, that pregnancy is a disease, in our public combating of abortion promotion in our culture. So I think I'm at time, and I want to thank you all so much, and I'm ready for questions.
Thank you, Jess. That was an absolute tour de force, and we really appreciate it. It's such a special treat for us to have you here, and with all the learning and research that you've done, as well as just in your person. It's just, I mean, we couldn't have asked for a better person to explore the questions that you explored this evening. So first of all, thank you. We're very grateful for you being part of the Vita Institute faculty. I'm going to make a couple comments and maybe raise some questions for you. We also received some questions that relate to last night's talk, and we might turn to those at some point. But one question I had, well, first a comment. It's really striking to notice, as you said so artfully throughout your entire remarks, that what the feminist arguments for abortion rights end up doing is privileging male normativity, right? They want women to be men. They want women to be as sexually available as men are. They want women to be unburdened by the consequences of wide open sexual behavior in the way that men are in principle. What do pro-choice feminists say when they're confronted with the proposition that the single greatest beneficiary of their ideology are men who want to have as licentious sexual encounters with women with no consequences? Mm-hmm. What do they say to that? Surely that issue is raised to them. What's their response?
I mean, the response that I have typically received when I raise that is denial, and that actually, abortion allows women for the first time to be free in their sexual relationships. But what sort of undermines that line of reasoning is some of Mark Regnish's work, which I mentioned, continues to show again and again that women are deeply unhappy with the sexual relationships that are prevalent in our culture now. That women have sex because they want commitment and they want marriage, and that men don't necessarily have sex for those reasons. So while on the one hand, pro-choice feminists will say that like women are now liberated to have sex the same way men are, the fact is that again and again we're seeing that women don't actually want that, and that's what the research says. So whether they're is admission to the fact that actually these sexual arrangements are neither desired by women nor conducive to their health and well-being. Feminists, I have found, pro-choice feminists, will sort of continue to vehemently assert as though assertion makes it so, just like in Kate Watson's work, as though it happens and therefore it's ethical. That's been my experience in those conversations.
Yeah, it seems to me that the pro-choice movement engages a kind of synergistic program with outlets like, I'm not a reader of Teen Vogue generally, but Teen Vogue and Planned Parenthood, who don't just promote abortion, but they also promote a lifestyle that valorizes male sexual stereotypes, right? The idea of the sort of free and open and exploring your own destiny unencumbered by social mores and restrictive norms and so on.
Or relationships.
Yeah. So it's also interesting to see how this male normativity has infected the constitutional law and the jurisprudence of abortion, because what you end up reading, and we discussed this last night in Harry Blackman's opinion, his entire account of pregnancy is as a burden, and the burdens go well beyond even the physical and psychic burdens of unwanted pregnancy. They immediately pivot and start talking about the burdens of unwanted parenthood and the burden that a child represents, and the burden not just to the woman but also to her family and to society generally. Unwanted children as a scourge of society, and so you see this, and Ruth Bader Ginsburg in her dissent in Gonzalez versus Carhart and elsewhere talks about abortion really as the fundamental mechanism of women's liberation, the fundamental mechanism by which women can pursue, I'm paraphrasing, equal citizenship stature with men, equal citizenship and equal participation in the economic and social life of the nation. And obviously the embedded unstated premise is that it's a genuine good for women to behave the way men do when they pursue their sexual appetites and desires without any kind of restraint from mores, norms, or external restrictions. The other thing that's interesting here is, I mean, was there an inflection point when the discourse moved from relational, like the idea of talking about what pregnancy is, and not to, I mean, I in my book that's coming out in October, What It Means to Be Human, The Case for the Body in Public Bioethics, available now for pre-order on Amazon.com. I talk about the anthropology of expressive individualism infusing abortion jurisprudence and abortion, American public discourse on abortion, because the way they talk about pregnancy is as a kind of clash of interest between atomized strangers, right? The idea that there's no, it's not a conflict between a mother and her child. It's a conflict between an atomized stranger, a parasite. You refer to us to the language of the unborn child being an alien invader or a parasite. You look at Judith Jarvis Thompson's, and various analogies in her defense of abortion, where in every instance, the child and the mother are strangers, right? At what point did that happen? I mean, at what point did the feminist orientation shift from relational anthropological premises that we are embedded in relations, situated in relations to other people, to this kind of atomized individualism describing the problem itself in terms of, the disembodied wills trying to seek their own advantage against others?
Yeah, that's a great question. And there probably isn't a pinpointed time. I think we see it begin with contraception, right? The contraception is there to help a woman pursue her own will and become a fully actualized human being, which is, of course, a good, but it's not being pregnant that allows you to do that and not to have unwanted children. I think we really start seeing the shift away from relational language in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. When abortion is spoken of prior to the 40s, we see abortion really spoken of in terms of an unfortunate social evil, and one in which the advocacy for legalization is primarily to prevent women from dying from illegal abortions, to the sort of positive arguments for abortion, which start occurring in the late 50s and 60s, that abortion, women are sort of burdened by pregnancy. We see that early on with contraceptive language that pregnancy is, of course, a burden. And then we see it sort of taken up into the abortion rights movement. I think as, it comes into our culture in full swing in the 50s and 60s, is sort of atomized. I pursue my individual will, you pursue your individual will. We'll adjudicate conflicts that essentially turn out to be whoever's stronger gets to adjudicate what the terms of engagement are. So I think it's really in the late 50s and early 60s that we see it come into discourse about abortion in our culture.
In your research, did you find any relationship between the religiosity or religious commitments of feminists and their views on abortion?
I didn't look at that specifically, but I believe all of the early feminists are committed Christians. And by the time we get to the early 60s, you have an increasingly, of course, secularizing culture. The people like Sidney Callahan and pro-life feminists are often Catholic. The pro-life movement before Roe v. Wade is largely underpinned by the Catholic Church as a social justice movement. And so many of your first pro-life feminists are Catholic, but I would imagine there's a turn in the teens and 20s after World War I where religiosity begins to shift in the United States, and you have this movement away from feminism being tied to truth, to virtue, to goodness, and toward autonomy, this sort of thin notion of freedom, and the atomized individual.
So here at Notre Dame, we're blessed by having people like you who are leading the charge to build a culture of life. We, the kids who participate in the Right to Life Club here at Notre Dame. It's the biggest club on campus. Dominated. The leadership is dominated by young women. You go to the March for Life. The landscape is populated by women. Every single major pro-life organization in America and abroad are run by women. So in some ways, there's a good story to tell, isn't there, about the role of women even now taking the lead in building a culture of life? How can we take advantage of that? And are there feminists in your judgment and women in judgment who are trying to recover the original understanding of feminism and pregnancy and marriage and family that you have been describing?
Yeah, I mean, I think Feminists for Life do a really great job. They're the organization that began when their founders were kicked out of the National Organization of Women. There are a number of grassroots organizations like New Wave Feminists. There are advocates in Africa. There's Women's Rights Without Frontiers, which is an organization that fights gender selective abortion in China. I think that what we're seeing the pro-life movement become younger and female. And I think that that's going to have a real impact on abortion in our culture in the next 20 to 40 years. Young women are sort of waking up to the fact, the science and also, the science of what abortion actually does. I think young people are very aware of that in a way that in the 70s, you could still refer to the, in popular culture, to the fetus as a blob of tissue, and nobody would question that. People are very aware of embryology now. And young women are very aware that pregnancy isn't a disease. So I think there's really great hope for the future in terms of women leading the charge in changing our culture and changing the laws in our country.
What advice would you give to young women or all women about who are pro-life and how they should engage their friends and neighbors who are pro-choice and who root their pro-choice sensibilities and views in a feminist framework, as you sketched out the later feminism? How should they and we engage in discourse with the people that we love who disagree with us on these issues?
So that's a great question. I'm not very good at that in my own life. I
don't believe that.
I think that one thing is educating yourself. So coming sort of like armed with knowledge about feminist history and knowledge about contemporary challenges that women are facing. There's a great book out. I don't know that she's the woman who wrote it is is pro-life, but it's titled How America Ruined Motherhood and What We Can Do About It. And it sort of talks about all of the things that a pro-life feminist would want to uphold: childcare, maternal maternity, for maternity leave. So I think one thing is educating. Read all that you can. There are a lot of great books out there that really are packed with great information about both the history of feminism, the history of the pro-life movement, etc. And then I think one of the most important things is to listen to people who disagree, and to find that sort of like hook where there's a common care or common desire, and to build off of that, and to help so identify what like the good is that they're pursuing, and then to build the conversation or your comments off of what that person thinks that they're achieving through abortion, and helping them to sort of see something different, at least expose them to a new way of thinking about it. And to also realize that people don't change their mind in one interaction. They change their mind over the course of sustained conversation and sustained relationship.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Thank you again for all of your fantastic contributions this evening, and always when you come back every year with us for the Vita Institute. We're blessed to have you at Notre Dame, blessed to have you as our colleague in the Vita Institute as well. That brings us to the end of our program this evening. Thank you, friends, again for joining us for this fourth session of the 2020 Vita Institute webinar. Thanks especially again to Jess Keating for her thought-provoking presentation. We are honored to have her as a colleague here at Notre Dame. To all of our benefactors and friends and staff colleagues who made this evening possible, we'd like to extend our heartfelt thanks. Tomorrow night, after the final lecture, we'll have some special message of thanks for the various people who have worked so hard to make this possible. We look forward to having you back with us tomorrow night for the concluding presentation, which will take place at 8 p.m. Eastern. We will welcome our good friend and faculty fellow, Father John Paul Kimes, who is also a professor in the law school here at Notre Dame now after 10.5 years of service in Rome for the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. He will be giving a presentation entitled Resisting the Throwaway Culture, echoing Pope Francis's call on us to situate our care for the unborn child within a larger set of commitments to the weak, the vulnerable, the poor, the disenfranchised. Until then, all of you take care of each other. Take care of yourselves. God bless you, and we'll see you tomorrow night.